A millionaire goes to the hospital. A nurse announces that a patient urgently needs B-negative blood. He volunteers to donate. But when he enters the room, he is shocked to see his ex giving birth to twins, the same woman he betrayed 9 months ago. He had no idea she was pregnant. Hi, my most respected, cherished, and unshakably loved family. Welcome home to Mr. Peter Stories. Each one of you holds a place in my heart that words often fail to describe. Because of your love and loyalty, we've grown to 23,000 strong. This is not just a number. It's 23,000 stories, 23,000 hearts, and one family I will forever honor. But lately, I felt something missing. Not your loyalty, but your voice. Why should I always ask for your likes and comments? If your heart is still here, let it speak without needing permission. I'm not angry. I care too much for that. But please, if you're still walking with me, if you still carry this bond, stand tall and say it proudly in the comments, I am here. And now, allow me to offer a prayer that comes straight from my soul to yours. May your hands never lack comfort. May your home always echo with peace. May your quiet prayers be heard, even when no one else is listening. May love stay close to you, and may your name be spoken with honor wherever life takes you. May your days be steady, your nights gentle, and your heart always feel safe. You are not just part of this journey, you are the journey. And if you feel that too, say it with love. I am here. The elevator doors slid open with a mechanical whisper, revealing the sterile white corridors of Mercy General Hospital's executive floor. Matt Hughes stepped out, his Italian leather shoes silent against the polished linoleum as he made his way toward Dr. Peterson's office. At 32, he carried himself with the confident stride of a man who had built a tech empire from nothing. But today, something felt different, heavier. 9 months. It had been exactly 9 months since he'd last walked these halls, and the antiseptic smell triggered memories he'd buried under 18-hour workdays and enough charitable donations to fund a small country. His annual executive physical was a routine he'd maintained religiously since his company went public, partly for insurance purposes, mostly because his board insisted their CEO stay healthy enough to make them richer. Mr. Hughes, Dr. Peterson's nurse smiled as he approached the reception desk. Right on time. The doctor will see you shortly. Matt nodded, settling into one of the plush leather chairs in the waiting area. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seattle's skyline stretched, endlessly raindrops racing down the glass like tears he refused to shed. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails about quarterly projections and merger negotiations. Anything to keep his mind from wandering to thoughts of dark skin, gentle hands, and the way someone used to laugh at his terrible jokes. Mr. Hughes? Dr. Peterson appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. Let's get started. The physical proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Blood pressure, slightly elevated. Heart rate, normal, though the doctor noted Matt looked tired. Weight, he'd lost 15 pounds, not intentionally. Matt answered the routine questions about sleep patterns, stress levels, and alcohol consumption with practiced deflection. He'd become an expert at avoiding conversations about anything that mattered. Everything looks good, Dr. Peterson concluded, as Matt buttoned his shirt. Though I'd recommend you consider talking to someone about stress management. Your cortisol levels are concerning for someone your age. Matt was sliding his arms into his suit jacket when the hospital's intercom crackled. To life with urgent static. Code Blue, maternity ward. We have an emergency need for B-negative blood. Any available B-negative donors, please report to the maternity ward immediately. Repeat, urgent need for B-negative blood in maternity. Dr. Peterson glanced at Matt's chart. You're B-negative, aren't you? Been donating since college, if I remember. Correctly! Matt froze, one arm halfway through his jacket sleeve. B-negative, the rarest blood type, shared by less than 2% of the population. He'd been donating since his freshman year at Stanford, partly from a genuine desire to help, partly because it was one of the few ways his rare blood could be useful to someone. "Mr. Hughes?" "Yes," Matt said slowly, pulling his jacket on completely. "I'm B negative. They really need you down there. Maternity emergencies." Dr. Peterson shook his head. "Time is everything." Without another word, Matt was moving. He didn't think about why his feet carried him so quickly toward the elevator, didn't question the sudden urgency that made his chest tight. Someone needed help. Someone with his blood type. It was simple math, simple human decency. The elevator ride to the maternity ward felt endless. Matt watched the floor numbers climb. 12, 13, 14, 15. His reflection stared back at him from the polished steel doors. Dark hair, slightly mussed from the examination. Grey eyes that people often called calculating, but which his mother had once described as sad. A face that had graced the cover of Forbes twice, but never looked quite right to him in photographs. The maternity ward was chaos, wrapped in controlled medical precision. Nurses moved with practiced urgency, their scrubs a rainbow of colors against the pale walls. Matt approached the nurses' station, his presence immediately commanding attention in the way money and authority always did. "I'm here about the B negative. Donation," he said to the first nurse who noticed him. "Thank God," she breathed, relief washing over her features. "Room 302. They're prepping for an emergency C-section. Mother and babies are in distress." Babies. Plural. Matt felt something cold settle in his stomach, but he pushed it aside. Coincidences happened. B negative blood was rare. He was simply being useful. He followed the nurse down a corridor that smelled of disinfectant and hope, past rooms where new families were beginning their stories and others where difficult endings were being written. Room 302 was at the end of the hall, its door partially open, revealing a controlled storm of medical activity. "Right through here," the nurse instructed, leading him toward what he assumed was a prep room for donation. "The patient is in active labor, but there are complications. We need to be ready for anything." Matt nodded, rolling up his sleeve as they walked. He'd done this dozens of times before. Simple procedure, needle in, blood out, save a life. Go home. Except they weren't heading to a donation room. They were heading directly into the delivery room. "I think there's been a mistake," Matt started to say, but the nurse was already pushing through the door, and he found himself following her into the controlled chaos of an emergency delivery. The room was a symphony of medical equipment and urgent voices. Monitors beeped steadily, tracking vital signs that Matt couldn't interpret. A team of doctors and nurses moved with practiced precision around the delivery bed, their focus laser-sharp on bringing new life safely into the world. And then Matt saw her. Nancy Nichols lay in the center of it all, her dark skin glistening with perspiration, her hair pulled back in a surgical cap, her face contorted with pain and effort. Even in the midst of labor, even with her features twisted in agony, she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. She was also supposed to be a memory, a chapter closed, a mistake he'd walked away from 9 months ago. 9 months. The math hit him like a physical blow. 9 months since that night. 9 months since he'd destroyed the best thing in his life. Because he was too much of a coward to admit he was terrified of being happy. 9 months since he'd told the woman he loved that she was getting too attached and that he'd never intended for their relationship to be serious. 9 months since she'd sat in his apartment, hand pressed to her stomach in a gesture he'd been too panicked to understand, trying to tell him something important while he was busy building walls and burning bridges. "Push, Nancy," the doctor was saying. "We're almost there. One more big push." Nancy's face was a mask of concentration and pain. Her entire being focused on bringing her children, their children, into the world. She hadn't seen him yet, standing, frozen in the doorway, like a man watching his entire world shift on its axis. "Mr. Hughes," the nurse whispered urgently beside him, "we need to get you prepped for donation. The babies might need transfusions and—" Nancy's head turned at the sound of his name. Her eyes, those warm brown eyes that had once looked at him with love and trust and infinite possibility, met his across the room. For a moment, time stopped. The medical equipment fell silent. The urgent voices faded to whispers. In that suspended moment, Matt saw everything: shock, recognition, and then pure, undiluted rage flooding across Nancy's features. Her body went rigid on the delivery table, her breathing becoming sharp and shallow in a way that had nothing to do with labor. "No!" she gasped, her voice cutting through the medical chatter like a blade. "No, no, no!" "Nancy, you need to focus," the doctor said firmly. "The baby is crowning. We need you to get him out." Nancy's voice rose to a desperate shout, her eyes never leaving Matt's face. "Get him out now!" The delivery room erupted into confused voices. Nurses looked between Nancy and Matt, trying to understand the sudden crisis that had nothing to do with the medical emergency they were managing. Dr. Miranda Santos, the attending physician, looked up from her position at the foot of the bed, her face a mask of professional concern. "Nancy, who is this man?" Dr. Santos asked sharply. "Security, please escort." "I'm the father," Matt said quietly, his voice barely audible over the chaos. The words felt foreign in his mouth, weighted with a reality he'd spent 9 months refusing to acknowledge. Nancy let out a sound that was part laugh, part sob, entirely broken. "Father?" She looked at him with eyes that held enough pain to drown a man. "You're not their father. You're just the coward who ran away." Security had arrived, 2 large men in uniform looking uncertain about how to handle a situation involving a laboring woman and what was clearly a very wealthy man. Matt raised his hands slowly, his grey eyes never leaving Nancy's face. "I'll go," he said softly. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Nancy." But as he turned to leave, Nancy's body was racked with another contraction, and despite everything, her anger, her pain, his presence that was clearly causing her distress, her medical training kicked in. She grabbed the nearest nurse's hand and pushed with everything she had. The first baby entered the world with a healthy cry that filled the room with joy and chaos. Matt stood frozen in the doorway, torn between Nancy's clear desire for him to leave and the impossible pull of hearing his child's first breath. "It's a boy," Dr. Santos announced, lifting the tiny, perfect infant. "He's beautiful, Nancy." Tears streamed down Nancy's face, but when her eyes found Matt again, they held nothing but cold fury. "Get him out!" she screamed again, her voice hoarse from effort. "I don't want him here. I don't want him to see them." "Another contraction," Dr. Santos warned. "Nancy, the second baby is coming. I need you to focus." Security moved toward Matt, but he was already backing toward the door, his heart breaking with every step. The last thing he saw before they escorted him from the room was Nancy's face, beautiful and fierce and absolutely devastating in her rejection of his presence at the most important moment of their children's lives. In the hallway, Matt slumped against the wall, his legs unsteady. Through the partially open door, he could hear the medical team working, Nancy's efforts, and then, the moment their second child entered the world with cries as strong as her brother's. A daughter. He had a son and a daughter who would grow up knowing their father as the man who'd abandoned their mother. Matt Hughes had built an empire worth billions, had never failed at anything he'd set his mind to. But unlike his business ventures, this failure might never be fixable. Chapter 2. Unspoken Truths. 9 months earlier. The charity gala at Mercy General Hospital was exactly the kind of event Matt Hughes usually endured rather than enjoyed. Champagne flutes clinked against forced conversation. Wealthy donors competed to see who could write the largest check, and everyone pretended their philanthropy wasn't primarily motivated by tax breaks and photo opportunities. Matt stood near the silent auction table, studying a vacation package to Tuscany he had no intention of bidding on when the accident happened. A server carrying a tray of champagne collided with a woman in navy scrubs who was clearly trying to slip through the crowd unnoticed. Glass shattered against the marble floor, and Matt watched as bubbling champagne soaked the front of the nurse's uniform. She stood frozen in mortification, surrounded by the wreckage of crystal and judgment. From Seattle's social elite, without thinking, Matt stepped forward. "My fault entirely," he announced loudly enough for nearby donors to hear. "I wasn't watching where I was going." The nurse looked up at him with dark brown eyes that held surprise and gratitude in equal measure. She was beautiful in a way that made his chest tight, natural, unguarded, with skin the color of warm honey and hair pulled back in a practical bun that somehow made her cheekbones look sculpted. When she smiled, something shifted inside him that he'd never experienced at any of these vapid social functions. "You don't have to do that," she said softly, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "I was the one not paying attention." "Nancy Nichols," she introduced herself, extending a hand that was steady despite the champagne dripping from her scrubs. "Pediatric nurse, 3rd floor. "Matt Hughes," he replied, taking her hand and feeling an electric shock of connection that had nothing to do with static electricity. Professional party crasher, apparently. Her laugh was genuine, musical, and completely at odds with the pretentious atmosphere surrounding them. "Are you really going to take the blame for my clumsiness?" "Absolutely. I have an image to maintain as Seattle's most philanthropically clumsy millionaire." The words came out easier than they ever had at these events, natural and unguarded in a way that surprised him. Nancy studied his face as if she could see straight through the facade he'd perfected over years of networking and deal-making. "You're serious. Dead serious. In fact, I insist on replacing your uniform and probably buying you dinner as an apology for my egregious sidewalk navigation skills." That was how it started. Not with grand gestures or calculated charm, but with champagne-soaked scrubs and a woman who saw right through him. Their first date ended up at a 24-hour diner, sharing pie while Nancy told him stories about her young patients. 8-year-old Marcus, who wore his superhero cape during chemo. 5-year-old Sophie, who drew pictures of her favorite nurses. "You love them," Matt observed, watching Nancy's face light up. "They're everything," Nancy replied. "Pure resilience, pure hope. They face things that would destroy most adults, and they still find ways to believe in tomorrow." Matt had never met anyone who spoke with such passion about healing children. His own career was built on strategic acquisitions, profitable but hardly inspiring. "What drives you?" Nancy asked. "When you're not taking blame for champagne catastrophes?" Looking at Nancy across their table, he found himself wanting to be driven by something meaningful. "I'm still figuring that out," he admitted, more honesty than he'd given anyone in years. Their relationship developed with frightening intensity. Matt began spending evenings at the hospital, not for publicity, but because Nancy's shift ended at 7, and he couldn't bear going to sleep without seeing her face. Nancy's tiny apartment felt more like home than his penthouse ever had. They made love like people who'd been starving. Nancy was generous and uninhibited, tracing the scars on his chest with gentle fingers and not asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. "I love you," Nancy whispered one night as they lay tangled in sheets. "I know it's too soon, but I love you, Matt Hughes." The words terrified him. Love meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant eventual abandonment. "I love you too," he whispered back, meaning it more than anything in his life. That was his first mistake. As their relationship deepened, Nancy began talking about their future with casual confidence. Meeting his friends, he realized he had none. Meeting her family at Christmas, he panicked and changed the subject. Moving in together, each conversation felt like a trap closing around him. Nancy spoke about when we and our plans, with the assumption that someday actually existed. Matt began having nightmares about waking up to find her gone, leaving nothing but a note explaining she'd realized she could do better. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in March. Nancy had made dinner, real dinner, with candles and wine. Matt arrived late from a business meeting, irritated from dealing with investors. "How was your day?" Nancy asked warmly. "Fine," Matt replied, the same non-answer he'd been giving for weeks. Nancy set down her fork. "You're pulling away from me." Matt felt his chest tighten with familiar panic. "I'm not pulling away, I'm here." "Physically, yes. Emotionally." Nancy shook her head. "It's like you're preparing for this to end." She was right. He'd been preparing since the moment it began, because everything good eventually ended. "Maybe we're moving too fast," Matt said carefully. Nancy's face went still. "What does that mean?" "Maybe we should slow down. Think about what we really want." "I know what I want," Nancy said quietly. "I want you. I want us. I want to build something real." Her certainty terrified him more than any business negotiation ever had. "Nancy," he started, but she held up her hand. "Never mind, I have something to tell you, and maybe it will help clarify things." She took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant, Matt. We're going to have a baby." The words hit him like a physical blow. Pregnant. Baby. The ultimate trap, the final chain that would bind him to someone he was destined to hurt. He stared at her across the table, watching hope and fear war across her beautiful features, and felt something inside him snap completely. "You're what?" His voice came out cold, controlled, nothing like the warmth she deserved. "Pregnant," Nancy repeated, her confidence cracking at his tone. "I know we haven't discussed children, but I hoped you'd be happy." Happy. She expected joy about being permanently bound to someone who would eventually realize he wasn't worth loving. "This is exactly what I mean," Matt said, standing abruptly. "You're getting too attached, Nancy, making assumptions about us." Nancy's face went pale. "What this is? Matt, I love you. You said you loved me too." "I never said this was permanent," he lied, hating himself with every word. "I never promised you forever." "You didn't have to promise it," Nancy whispered, her voice breaking. "I could feel it. Every time you touched me, every time you looked at me like I was the only woman in the world." "You read too much into things," Matt cut her off, his voice deliberately cruel. "I enjoy spending time with you, but that doesn't mean I want to play house and start a family. We're from different worlds, Nancy. This was never going to be permanent." Nancy stood slowly, her hand unconsciously moving to her still flat stomach. "Different worlds," she repeated, as if testing the words for truth. "You mean I'm not good enough for you?" "That's not what I said. It's what you meant." Nancy's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "I'm good enough to sleep with, good enough to spend time with when you're bored, but not good enough to build a life with." "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Matt said, the phrase feeling like acid on his tongue. We both knew this wasn't serious. Nancy stared at him for a long moment, and he watched as hurt transformed into something harder, more protective. "Get out! Nancy, get out of my apartment. Get out of my life, and don't you dare come back here pretending you care when you've made it clear that you don't." Matt left that night and never came back. He told himself it was better this way. Cleaner. Nancy would realize she was better off without him, would find someone worthy of her love, and build the family she deserved with a man who wouldn't destroy everything he touched. What he didn't know was that Nancy had spent the next 3 months calling his office, leaving messages that were never returned. She'd tried to tell him about doctor's appointments and ultrasounds, and the day they'd learned they were having twins. His assistant, following his explicit instructions to handle all personal matters, had informed Nancy that Mr. Hughes was unavailable and would not be accepting any further contact. Present day. She tried to reach you, Sarah Nichols said, her voice sharp with accusation as she stood in the hospital waiting room. Nancy's older sister had arrived within an hour of the twins' birth, and she clearly held Matt personally responsible for every minute of pain her sister had endured. I didn't know, Matt said quietly, slumped in a plastic chair that had probably been designed by someone who'd never experienced real despair. I told my assistant to handle my personal calls, but you never thought she'd have something important to tell you? Like the fact that she was carrying your children. The words hit him like physical blows. She tried to tell me about the pregnancy? Multiple times. She called your office, sent letters to your company. Your assistant told her you weren't available for personal matters and that she should stop calling. Sarah's dark eyes, so similar to Nancy's but harder, more judgmental, bored into him. So she did. She stopped calling and decided to raise your children alone rather than beg for attention from a man who'd made it clear she wasn't worth his time. Matt closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his own stupidity crushing down on him. I didn't. No, he repeated, but the words felt inadequate even to his own ears. You didn't want to know, Sarah corrected. There's a difference. Through the window of the family waiting area, Matt could see nurses moving efficiently through the hallways, carrying flowers and balloons to rooms where new families were celebrating the best day of their lives. Somewhere in this building, Nancy was recovering from giving birth to his children she'd carried alone for 9 months, while he'd convinced himself he was protecting her by staying away. What are their names? He asked quietly. Sarah studied his face for a long moment before answering. Thomas, Matthew, and Emma Grace. She gave them your name as their middle name, even after everything you put her through. Thomas Matthew. Emma Grace. His children had names, had taken their first breaths, had entered the world while he stood frozen in a doorway like a coward. Again, can I see them? Matt asked, though he already knew the answer from the way Sarah's expression hardened. Nancy was very clear about that. You're not to come near her or the babies. If you try, she'll call security. Matt nodded, accepting the judgment he'd earned. Will you tell her something for me? I'm not your messenger service. Please, Matt said, the words scraping his throat raw. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I know sorry isn't enough, but I need her to know that I never stopped. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Never stopped what? Loving her, Matt whispered. I never stopped loving her. I was just too much of a coward to stay and prove it. Sarah's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. Love isn't something you feel, Mr. Hughes. It's something you do. And what you did was abandon my sister when she needed you most. With that devastating truth, Sarah walked away, leaving Matt alone in the waiting room with the weight of his failures and the echoing cries of children he might never get to hold. Chapter 3. First Rejection. The Hospital Confrontation. 3 days. Matt had spent 3 days pacing the halls of his penthouse, staring at his phone, drafting and deleting text messages he'd never send. 3 days of barely eating, not sleeping, and trying to process the reality that he was a father to twins he'd never held, children who bore his name but would grow up knowing him only as the man who'd abandoned their mother. The flowers had cost more than most people's cars, not because he thought money could fix what he'd broken, but because he didn't know how else to begin. 24 white roses, Nancy's favorites, though he doubted she'd remember that he'd ever paid attention to such details. The florist had wanted to include an elaborate arrangement with exotic blooms and gold accents, but Matt had insisted on simplicity. Nancy had always been beautiful in her naturalness. She didn't need gilding. The card had taken him 47 attempts to write. 47 crumpled pieces of expensive stationery scattered across his marble floor like white flags of surrender. In the end, he'd settled on something pathetically simple. For Thomas and Emma, please let me try to do better. Matt Mercy General Hospital felt different during afternoon visiting hours. The controlled chaos of emergency medicine gave way to a gentler rhythm. Families coming and going, grandparents meeting grandbabies for the first time, new fathers walking the halls with exhausted pride written across their faces. Matt moved through this landscape of joy, feeling like an intruder, his expensive suit and guilty conscience marking him as someone who didn't belong in this world of natural happiness. Room 318. Nancy's room number had been surprisingly easy to obtain. A generous donation to the hospital's children's wing had made the nursing staff remarkably accommodating. Not bribery exactly, but close enough to make Matt hate himself a little more. He stood outside her door for a full 5 minutes, listening to the soft sounds from within, a television playing quietly, the rustle of bed sheets, and underneath it all, the tiny noises that could only come from newborns. His children, Thomas and Emma, 2 lives he'd helped create but had no right to claim. Taking a breath that felt like swallowing glass, Matt knocked gently. "Come in," Nancy's voice called, warm and tired and completely unprepared for what was coming. Matt pushed open the door and stepped into a room that felt like stepping into sunlight. Nancy sat propped, up in the hospital bed, her hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a soft yellow robe that made her skin glow. She was more beautiful than his memory had managed to preserve. Motherhood had added something radiant to her features, a soft contentment that made his chest ache with longing. But it was the babies that stopped his heart completely. Nancy held, one against her chest, skin-to-skin contact that spoke of maternal instinct and fierce protection. The baby, he couldn't tell if it was Thomas or Emma from the doorway, was tiny and perfect, with dark hair and skin that was a beautiful blend of both parents. The second baby lay sleeping in a bassinet beside the bed, equally perfect, equally miraculous. For a moment, the 3 of them existed in a bubble of peaceful perfection. This was what he'd thrown away. This was the family he'd been too terrified to claim. Then Nancy looked up and saw him. The transformation was immediate and devastating. The soft contentment vanished from her face, replaced by something hard and protective and utterly closed off. Her arms tightened around the baby she held, and her entire body went rigid with tension. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was quiet, controlled, but Matt could hear the edge of panic underneath. "I brought these for you," Matt said lamely, holding up the flowers like they were a peace offering instead of a pathetic gesture. "For the babies." Nancy stared at the roses for a long moment, something like pain flickering across her features before the protective mask returned. "You remember that I like white roses." "I remember everything about you," Matt said softly, taking a step closer. "Don't." Nancy's voice cracked like a whip. "Don't come closer, and don't stand there talking about remembering me. You remembered me enough to walk away." Matt stopped, his hands tightening around the flower stems. "Nancy, I know I have no right to be here, but—" "You're right. You don't have any right to be here." Nancy shifted the baby to her other arm, and Matt caught a glimpse of a tiny face, perfect features relaxed in sleep. "You want to see your children? Fine. Here they are." She gestured toward the bassinet with her free hand, then pulled back the blanket covering the baby she held. "Thomas and Emma Hughes Nichols. Take a good look, because it's the last time you'll see them without a court order." The names hit him like physical blows. Hughes Nichols. She'd given them his name, even after everything, even after he'd destroyed. Her trust, and abandoned her when she was most vulnerable. She'd still wanted their children to carry part of him with them. "They're beautiful," Matt whispered, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't contain. "They look like you. They look like themselves," Nancy corrected sharply. "And they're mine. I carried them for 9 months while you decided whether or not you wanted to be a father. I went to every appointment alone, felt every kick alone, went through labor alone. These are my children." "Our children," Matt said quietly, and immediately realized it was the wrong thing to say. Nancy's eyes flashed with fury. "Our children? You think because you contributed DNA 9 months ago, you get to claim ownership? You called me clingy, Matt. You said I was getting too attached, like love was some kind of disease. Now you want to attach yourself to my children." The Tat, baby in her arms, stirred at the sound of raised voices, making a small noise of distress. Nancy immediately softened her tone, cooing gently and rocking the infant back to sleep with practiced ease. The sight of her natural maternal instincts made Matt's chest tighten with a mixture of awe and regret. "I was scared," Matt said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was terrified of being a father, of being responsible for someone else's happiness. I'd never had a family before, Nancy. I didn't know how to—" "Scared?" Nancy's laugh was bitter and sharp. "You think you were the only one who was scared. I was 28 years old, pregnant with twins, and the man I loved told me I was too attached to him. Do you think I wasn't terrified?" Matt wanted to cross the room, to kneel beside her bed and beg for forgiveness, to explain about foster homes and abandonment and the bone-deep terror that came from loving someone too much. But the way Nancy held their child, protective, defensive, like she was shielding the baby from his very presence, made it clear that explanations were 9 months too late. "I'm sorry," he said instead, the words feeling inadequate and hollow. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I'm so sorry, Nancy. Sorry doesn't change the fact that I went through pregnancy alone. Sorry doesn't change the fact that I had to choose names by myself, that I had to feel them move and grow without anyone to share it with. Sorry doesn't change the fact that when I went into labor, I was terrified I might die, and they'd never know their father because you'd made it clear you didn't want to be found." Each word was a precisely aimed blow, and Matt took them all because he deserved everyone. He'd earned her anger, her pain, her absolute right to protect their children from the man who'd already proven himself unreliable. "What can I do?" Matt asked desperately. "How can I make this right?" Nancy stared at him for a long moment, and for just an instant he saw something that might have been longing flicker across her features. Then it was gone, replaced by iron resolve. "You can leave," she said quietly. "You can walk out of this room and let me raise my children in peace." "I can't do that," Matt said, his voice breaking. "They're my children too, Nancy. I know I don't deserve them, but I can't just walk away again." "You already walked away," Nancy reminded him, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "You looked me in the face and told me we were from different worlds, that what we had wasn't serious. You made your choice 9 months ago. I made the wrong choice." "Yes, you did. And now you have to live with the consequences." Nancy reached over and pressed the call button beside her bed. "I think you should leave before I call security." Matt felt panic rising in his chest. This couldn't be how it ended. He couldn't lose them again before he'd even had a chance to try. "Nancy, please, just give me a chance to—" "No." The word was final, absolute. "You don't get to decide when you're ready to be a father, Matt. You don't get to show up when it's convenient for your guilt and expect me to welcome you with open arms." The door opened and a nurse appeared, her expression professional but concerned. "Is everything all right, Nancy?" "Mr. Hughes was just leaving," Nancy said without taking her eyes off Matt's face. "He won't be coming back." The nurse looked between them, clearly sensing the tension but uncertain how to proceed. Matt made the decision for her, setting the roses on the bedside table and backing toward the door. "This isn't over," he said quietly, but Nancy shook her head. "Yes, it is. The same way it was over 9 months ago when you decided I wasn't worth fighting for." Her voice broke slightly on the last words, revealing the pain she was trying so hard to hide. "I won't let my children go through the same heartbreak you put me through. I won't let them wonder why they weren't enough to make their father stay." Matt wanted to tell her that it had never been about her not being enough, that she'd been too much, too perfect, too good for someone as broken as him. But the words stuck in his throat because he knew they would sound like excuses. And Nancy deserved better than excuses. "I love you," he said instead, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "I love you and I love them. And I know I have no right to say that after what I did, but love isn't what you feel." Nancy interrupted, unconsciously echoing her sister's words from 3 days earlier. "Love is what you do, and what you did was abandon us." Security appeared in the doorway, 2 large men who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else than escorting a grieving father away from his newborn children. Matt held up his hands in surrender. "I'll go," he said quietly. "But, Nancy, this isn't over. I'm going to find a way to make this right." Nancy's hands shook as she adjusted the baby in her arms, but her voice remained steady. "Don't contact me again, Matt. If you want to see them, you can go through the courts. But I won't make it easy for you. I won't let you hurt them the way you hurt me." Matt walked out of that hospital room, feeling like he was leaving pieces of his soul behind. In the elevator, surrounded by other visitors heading home to their own families, he finally understood the true cost of his cowardice. He'd lost more than Nancy's love. He'd lost the right to be a father to his own children. But as the elevator descended toward the parking garage, carrying him away from everything that mattered, Matt made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. Nancy was right. Love wasn't what you felt. It was what you did. And for the first time in his life, Matt Hughes was going to fight for something that mattered more than money or success or protecting himself from pain. He was going to fight for his family, even if it took everything he had. Chapter 4. Second, rejection, legal warfare. The law offices of Morrison, Klein and Associates occupied 3 floors of downtown Seattle's most prestigious building. Richard Morrison handled only high-profile cases requiring discretion that could only be bought with obscene money. Matt sat across from Morrison's mahogany desk, feeling every inch the desperate father he'd become. 2 weeks had passed since Nancy ordered him out of her hospital room. "Paternity establishment is straightforward," Morrison said. "We file the petition, request DNA testing, and within 60 days you'll have legal recognition. From there, we pursue visitation rights, even joint custody." "Joint custody," Matt repeated. "Half their lives, half their bedtime stories, half their Christmas mornings. Ms. Nichols will contest it," Morrison continued, "but you're financially stable, have no criminal record, and can provide advantages she simply can't match. Private schools, trust funds, opportunities she could never afford on a nurse's salary." The casual dismissal of Nancy's worth made Matt's jaw tighten. "This isn't about money. Mr. Hughes, in family court, everything is about what's best for the children. A judge will have difficulty arguing that a struggling single mother can provide better opportunities than a man of your resources. What are my chances? Excellent, as long as you can demonstrate genuine interest, which your willingness to pursue legal action shows. I'd say better than 70% odds." "Draft the papers," Matt said, hating himself. Nancy stared at the legal documents spread across her kitchen table, the formal language seeming to leap off the pages like accusations. Petition for paternity determination and custody rights. Motion for court-ordered visitation. Request for genetic testing. Her one-bedroom apartment felt even smaller with her sister Sarah pacing angrily across the worn carpet, baby Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms while Thomas dozed in his bouncer near the window. This was supposed to be their safe space, their sanctuary from the world and its complications. Now it felt invaded by legal terminology and the weight of Matt's determination to insert himself into their carefully constructed life. "He's actually doing it," Sarah said, her voice tight with fury. "He's actually trying to take them away from you." "Not take them," Nancy corrected wearily, though the distinction felt academic. "The petition is for shared custody and visitation. Rights. He wants to be their father." 9 months too late. Nancy couldn't argue with that. 9 months of pregnancy, 2 weeks of newborn life, and countless moments when she'd wondered if their father would ever want to know them. Now, faced with legal action instead of genuine remorse, she felt something harden inside her chest that might never soften again. Margaret Yates arrived 30 minutes later, her no-nonsense demeanor and budget briefcase a stark contrast to whatever legal firepower Matt had undoubtedly assembled. Legal aid attorneys didn't wear designer suits or charge fees that could feed a family for a year. But Margaret had 20 years of experience fighting for women who couldn't afford better representation. "I've reviewed the petition," Margaret said without preamble, settling into Nancy's second-hand chair with the ease of someone accustomed to making do. "Mr. Hughes has strong legal counsel and significant financial resources. This isn't going to be a simple case." "What are my chances of keeping them?" Nancy asked, unconsciously echoing Matt's question from Morrison's office. "Honestly, if this goes to trial, it's going to be difficult. Fathers' rights advocates have been very successful in recent years, and judges are increasingly reluctant to deny paternity rights without evidence of abuse or neglect." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "You're a good mother, Nancy, but the court's primary concern is what's best for the children, and they'll look at things like financial stability, educational opportunities, and long-term advantages." "So money wins," Nancy said bitterly. "Money helps," Margaret corrected, "but it's not everything. Mr. Hughes abandoned you during your pregnancy. He made no effort to be involved until the children were already born. That pattern of behavior is something we can use." "Money helps," Margaret corrected, "but it's not everything. Mr. Hughes abandoned you during your pregnancy. He made no effort to be involved until the children were already born. That pattern of behavior is something we can use." Nancy felt a spark of hope. "How?" "We challenge his commitment. If he truly wanted to be a father, why didn't he respond when you tried to contact him? Why did he wait until after the birth to assert his rights? We paint a picture of a man who wants to play father when it's convenient, but has no real understanding of the daily responsibilities involved." It felt like preparing for war, which Nancy supposed was exactly what this was. A custody battle where her children would become pawns and their family's private pain would be dissected in a courtroom full of strangers. "There's something else," Margaret added carefully. "Mr. Hughes has significant resources, which means he can drag this out for months, possibly years. Legal aid can represent you, but our resources are limited. If he wants to wear you down through extended litigation..." The implication hung in the air like a threat. Matt could afford to fight for as long as it took. Nancy was already struggling to balance work with caring for newborn twins. Adding months of legal battles would stretch her past her breaking point. "I won't give up my children," Nancy said quietly, but with steel in her voice. "I don't care how long it takes or how much money he has. They're mine." The King County Family Court building was a monument to bureaucratic efficiency, all concrete and fluorescent lighting, designed to strip emotion from proceedings that were, by their very nature, deeply personal. Nancy sat at the defendant's table beside Margaret, trying to project calm, while her heart hammered against her ribs. Across the aisle, Matt sat with his legal team, looking every inch the successful businessman in his perfectly tailored suit. This was the first time she'd seen him since the hospital, and the sight of him made her chest tight with memories she'd worked hard to bury. He'd lost weight, she noticed. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain, shadows under his grey eyes, a tension in his shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights. Good, she thought viciously. Let him suffer a fraction of what she'd endured. All rise for the Honourable. Judge Patricia Chen, the bailiff announced, and the courtroom rustled to attention. Judge Chen was a slight woman in her 50s, with intelligent eyes and greying hair pulled back in a practical bun. She settled behind the bench with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to making decisions that would forever alter people's lives. We're here for the matter of Hughes vs. Nichols, regarding paternity determination and custody arrangements. For minor children, Thomas Matthew Hughes Nichols and Emma Grace Hughes Nichols. Judge Chen's voice carried the weight of judicial authority. Mr. Morrison, you may proceed with your opening statement. Morrison rose with theatrical precision, every movement calculated for maximum impact. Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about a father's right to know and care for his children. Mr. Hughes acknowledges that his initial response to Ms. Nichols's pregnancy was inadequate, but he stands before this court today, ready to accept full responsibility for his children's welfare and future. Nancy felt sick listening to the sanitized version of events. Inadequate response made it sound like Matt had simply failed to send flowers, not that he'd deliberately destroyed their relationship and fled from responsibility. Mr. Hughes is prepared to provide financial support, educational opportunities, and stability that will ensure these children have every advantage in life, Morrison continued. He's not seeking to diminish Ms. Nichols' role as their mother, but rather to establish his rightful place as their father. When Morrison sat down, Margaret rose with quiet dignity. She lacked Morrison's theatrical flair, but her words carried the weight of truth and lived experience. Your Honor, Mr. Hughes may be ready to be a father now, but he wasn't ready when Ms. Nichols needed him most. During her pregnancy, she attempted multiple times to contact him, to include him in medical appointments and preparations for their children's arrival. His office repeatedly told her he was unavailable for personal matters. Nancy watched Matt's face as Margaret spoke, saw him flinch at the accurate description of his abandonment. Part of her felt a savage satisfaction at his obvious discomfort. Another part, buried deeper and fiercely suppressed, ached at the pain written across his features. This isn't a case about father's rights, Margaret continued. This is about a man who walked away from responsibility and now wants to claim the benefits of fatherhood without acknowledging the consequences of his abandonment. Ms. Nichols has been the sole provider, sole caregiver, and sole decision-maker for these children since conception. She's asking this court to protect her children from the emotional instability of a man who has already proven he will leave when circumstances become difficult. The words hit their target. Matt's composure cracked slightly, his hands clenching. On the table in front of him, Nancy felt a fierce surge of pride in Margaret's unflinching defense. I'd like to call Ms. Nichols to the stand, Margaret announced. Walking to the witness stand felt like a death march. Nancy kept her eyes straight ahead, refusing to look at Matt as she passed his table. The bailiff swore her in with practiced efficiency, and Nancy settled into the witness chair with as much dignity as she could muster. Ms. Nichols, Margaret began gently, can you tell the court about your relationship with Mr. Hughes? We dated for 6 months, Nancy replied, her voice steady despite the emotional minefield she was navigating. I thought we were building something real together. He told me he loved me. When did you learn you were pregnant? In March. I was excited to tell him. I thought he'd be happy. Nancy's voice caught slightly on the last word, remembering that night and the hope that had been so brutally crushed. How did Mr. Hughes respond when you told him about the pregnancy? Nancy took a breath, forcing herself to remain clinical in her recounting. He told me I was getting too attached. He said he'd never intended for our relationship to be serious, that we were from different worlds. He broke up with me that night. Did you attempt to contact him after that? Yes, multiple times. I called his office, sent letters to his company. I wanted him to know about doctor's appointments, about the ultrasounds, about the day we learned we were having twins. Nancy's voice grew stronger as she spoke, fueled by righteous anger. His assistant told me repeatedly that Mr. Hughes was unavailable for personal matters and that I should stop calling. How did that make you feel? Morrison rose immediately. Objection, Your Honor. The witness's feelings are irrelevant to the legal determination of custody. Judge Chen considered for a moment. I'll allow it. The emotional impact of Mr. Hughes's actions is relevant to assessing his fitness as a parent. Nancy looked directly at Matt for the first time since entering the courtroom. His grey eyes were fixed on her face with an expression of such profound regret that she almost lost her composure. It made me feel worthless, she said quietly, like I was something to be discarded when I became inconvenient. I realized that the man I'd fallen in love with either never existed or was someone I'd never really known. Morrison's cross-examination was brutal but predictable. He painted Nancy as vindictive, as a woman keeping children from their father out of spite. He questioned her financial ability to provide for twins, suggested that her work schedule as a nurse would leave the children in daycare while Matt could afford full-time nannies and the best private schools. Nancy answered each question with calm precision, refusing to be rattled by Morrison's obvious attempts to make her appear unstable or vindictive. But she could feel the courtroom's mood shifting, could sense that Morrison's arguments about financial advantages and opportunities were having their intended effect. When Matt took the stand, Nancy braced herself for more sanitized explanations and carefully crafted remorse. Instead, she got something that surprised her: raw, unvarnished truth. I was terrified, Matt said in response to Morrison's question about his initial reaction to the pregnancy news. I'd grown up in foster care, never had a real family. The idea of being responsible for someone else's happiness, of potentially failing children the way my own parents had failed me. I panicked. But you're ready now to accept that responsibility? I'm ready to try, Matt corrected. I can't promise I'll be perfect, but I can promise that I'll never abandon them again. They deserve better than what I gave Nancy, and I want the chance to prove that I can be the father they need. Margaret's cross-examination was merciless. Mr. Hughes, you say you were terrified of being a father. Were you also terrified of being a boyfriend, a partner, a husband? Yes. But you entered into a relationship with Ms. Nichols anyway, knowing you had these issues? Matt's jaw tightened. I thought I could handle it. You thought you could handle it, Margaret repeated. But when it became real, when there were actual consequences to your relationship, you ran. Yes. And now you want this court to believe that you're ready to handle the responsibilities of fatherhood? I've been in therapy, Matt said quietly. I'm working on my issues. For how long? Matt hesitated. 6 weeks. 6 weeks of therapy to address a lifetime of abandonment issues, Margaret said, her voice dripping with skepticism. Mr. Hughes, if you couldn't commit to a relationship with the woman you claim to love, how can you commit to children who will need you every day for the next 18 years? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Matt looked across the courtroom at Nancy, and she saw something break in his expression. I can't make any promises about forever, he said finally. But I can promise that I want to try. These are my children, and I want the chance to know them, even if that means disrupting the stable home Ms. Nichols has created. I don't want to disrupt anything. I want to be part of it. Margaret smiled coldly. Mr. Hughes, you can't have it both ways. You can't abandon someone and then expect to be welcomed back into their life when it suits you. Fatherhood isn't a part-time job you take when you're ready for it. Judge Chen called a brief recess, and Nancy followed Margaret into the hallway, her hands shaking with adrenaline and suppressed emotion. "How did we do?" Nancy asked. Margaret's expression was grim. "He was more honest than I expected, which actually hurts our case. The court likes to see remorse and growth. And his financial advantages are real, Nancy. A judge looking at private schools versus public schools, trust funds versus student loans. It's going to be a factor." When court reconvened, Judge Chen delivered her ruling with the clinical precision of someone accustomed to altering lives with a few words. This court recognizes Mr. Hughes as the biological father of the minor children and grants him supervised visitation rights, beginning with 2 hours every Saturday in a neutral location. Ms. Nichols will retain primary physical custody. Mr. Hughes is ordered to pay child support in the amount of $3,000 per month. This arrangement will be reviewed in 6 months to assess Mr. Hughes' consistency and commitment to his parental responsibilities. Nancy felt simultaneously victorious and defeated. She'd kept primary custody, but Matt had gotten exactly what he'd asked for: legal recognition and access to their children. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. Outside the courthouse, Nancy stood on the steps while Margaret packed her papers. Matt emerged alone, his legal team having vanished into black sedans. For a moment, only 3 feet of concrete and 9 months of hurt separated them. "Nancy," Matt said quietly, exhaustion weighing his voice. She faced him, surprised by her own composure. "You got what you wanted. Congratulations." "This isn't what I wanted," Matt replied. "I wanted you to forgive me. I wanted us to find our way back to each other." Nancy's laugh held no humor. "You wanted a fight? You got one, and you lost. Don't contact me outside of court-mandated visits, Matt. We're done." She walked away without looking back, leaving Matt alone on the courthouse steps. But even as she climbed into Sarah's car, Nancy couldn't shake the memory of broken pain in Matt's eyes when she'd delivered her final blow. Chapter 5. Third Rejection. The Volunteer Trap. 6 months of supervised visits had established a painful rhythm. Every Saturday at 10 a.m., Matt would spend 2 hours under Mrs. Patterson's watchful eye, then leave feeling like he'd touched something precious, only to have it snatched away. Thomas and Emma were growing with alarming speed, changing so rapidly that each week brought new milestones he was missing between their stilted encounters. The supervised visits were sterile affairs in a room that smelled like disinfectant and broken families. Mrs. Patterson observed every interaction while Matt tried to bond with children who remained essentially strangers. "They're beautiful children," Mrs. Patterson noted. "Well-adjusted, healthy, clearly well cared for. They seem comfortable with you, Mr. Hughes." Comfortable. Such a lukewarm assessment of what should have been the most important relationship of his life. The therapy sessions with Dr. Rebecca Walsh had become the most honest conversations of Matt's life. Twice a week, he dissected 32 years of emotional avoidance and abandonment issues. "Tell me about this week's visit," Dr. Walsh said. Emma laughed, Matt said, wonder in his voice. Really laughed. "I was making faces at her and she thought it was the funniest thing in the world." "How did that make you feel?" "Like getting a taste of water when you're dying of thirst." "What would it take to prove that you've changed?" "Time," Matt said immediately. "Consistency. Being there when I say I will every time, for as long as it takes." This conversation led to his decision to volunteer at Mercy General's pediatric ward. Working with children fighting for their lives put his problems in perspective. The kids didn't care about his net worth. They just wanted someone to read stories and play games and listen to their fears. Matt had been volunteering for 3 months when Nancy discovered his presence. 3 months of reading to 8-year-old Marcus, who insisted Batman could beat cancer through sheer determination. 3 months of playing board games with Sophie, who drew pictures of her favorite nurses and demanded Matt hang them on the playroom wall. 3 months of learning that being genuinely useful felt better than any business success. He was mid-game of Connect 4 with 10-year-old David when he saw Nancy walk past the playroom window. She stopped mid-stride, her face cycling through surprise, recognition, and fury. Matt's heart rate spiked, but he forced himself to finish the game. David was undergoing chemotherapy for leukemia, and their weekly games had become the highlight of both their weeks. The boy deserved his full attention, regardless of the storm that was undoubtedly brewing in the hallway. "You let me win," David accused, but he was grinning as he said it. "I would never," Matt replied with mock seriousness. "You're just getting too good at this game. Will you be here next week?" The question that had become ritual, because children, in pediatric cancer wards, learned early that adults made promises they couldn't keep. Matt met David's eyes with the honesty the boy deserved. "I'll be here," he said simply, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Nancy was waiting for him in the hallway when he left the playroom, her arms crossed and her expression thunderous. She'd changed out of her scrubs into jeans and a sweater, which meant her shift was over and she'd been waiting specifically to confront him. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "Now!" Matt followed her down the corridor, past the nurses' station where several of Nancy's colleagues watched with undisguised curiosity. He'd been careful not to mention his connection to Nancy. During his volunteer work, introducing himself simply as Matt, a businessman who wanted to give back. But hospital gossip being what it was inevitable that someone would make the connection between the man reading to children and Nancy's baby daddy who'd been causing such drama. Nancy led him to the parking garage, her heels clicking against concrete with sharp, angry rhythm. The sound echoed off the low ceiling, creating an atmosphere that felt distinctly confrontational. When they reached her car, Nancy turned to face him with the controlled fury of someone who'd been planning this conversation for hours. "You're stalking me at my workplace now?" Her voice echoed off the concrete walls, carrying the weight of months of suppressed anger. "Using sick children to manipulate me? That's low even for you." The accusation hit Matt like a physical blow. "Nancy, it's not what you think. It's exactly what I think," she interrupted, stepping closer until he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes that had once looked at him with love. "You're volunteering with pediatric patients because you know I work here. You're trying to rehabilitate your image, playing the part of the caring father figure while you fight me for custody of our children." "That's not why I'm here," Matt said desperately. "I volunteer because these kids need people they can count on." Nancy cut him off, her voice rising with each word. "They need adults who won't disappear when things get hard. They don't need you using them as props in your campaign to convince a judge that you're father material." Matt felt anger flare in his chest, not at Nancy, but at the impossible situation he'd created for himself. Everything he did now was suspect, every gesture interpreted through the lens of his past failures. He couldn't volunteer at a hospital without it being manipulation. He couldn't express genuine care for sick children without it being strategic. "You're wrong," he said quietly, but with steel in his voice. "I'm here because David looks forward to our games, because Marcus needs someone to believe in his superhero theories, because Sophie draws me pictures that I hang on my refrigerator and think about every day." "Right," Nancy said with bitter sarcasm. "The rich guy who abandoned his own children suddenly cares about other people's kids. How convenient. I am trying to be a better person," Matt said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. "I'm trying to learn how to care about someone other than myself, but apparently even that is wrong in your eyes." Nancy laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to know what's wrong? What's wrong is that you're trying to become the man I needed you to be 9 months too late. You're reading to sick children, while your own children see you for 2 hours a week under supervision. You're learning to be caring and consistent with everyone except the people who actually need you to be those things. The words hit their target with devastating precision. Matt felt something crack inside his chest, the careful composure he'd maintained for months finally beginning to crumble. "I see them every week," he said weakly. "I'm trying to build a relationship with Thomas and Emma." 2 hours on Saturday is not a relationship, Nancy shot back. "It's an appointment. Those children don't know you, Matt. They don't trust you. They don't run to you when they're scared or look for you when they're happy, because you haven't earned those things. But somehow you think volunteering here will prove you're ready to be a father." Matt wanted to explain about the therapy, about the progress he'd made in understanding his own psychology, about the way working with terminally ill children had taught him about courage and resilience. But Nancy's anger was a wall he couldn't breach with explanations or justifications. "I'm trying," he said simply, the words inadequate but honest. "You're performing," Nancy corrected, her voice deadly quiet. "You're putting on a show for the court, for the social workers, for everyone except the people who actually matter. Those children trust you because they don't know what you really are. But I do. I know you run when things get real." She moved toward her car, fishing keys out of her purse with hands that trembled slightly despite her controlled fury. Matt stepped forward instinctively, some part of him still believing he could fix this with the right words. "Nancy, please, just let me explain." "Explain what?" She whirled to face him again, and Matt saw tears gathering in her eyes despite her anger. "Explain how you couldn't commit to the woman you claim to love, but you can commit to reading stories to cancer patients. Explain how you can show up consistently for children who aren't yours, but you couldn't show up for your own." The parking garage fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic from the street above. Nancy stood beside her car, keys clutched. In her fist, looking every inch the warrior mother protecting her cubs from a threat they didn't understand. "I love you," Matt said desperately, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "I love you and I love our children, and I know I've made terrible mistakes, but love," Nancy repeated, as if the word tasted bitter in her mouth. "You keep using that word like it means something, like it excuses everything you've done." "It doesn't excuse anything," Matt admitted, "but it's real, Nancy. Whatever else you think about me, what I feel for you is real." Nancy stared at him for a long moment, and Matt saw something that might have been pain flicker across her features before the protective mask slipped back into place. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" she asked quietly. "I see a man who's very good at wanting things he can't have and very bad at fighting for things he can. You want to love me. You want to be a father to our children. Then stop performing for everyone else and start doing the work where it actually matters." She opened her car door, then paused to deliver one final devastating blow. "Those children in there," she gestured toward the hospital. "They trust you because they don't know you'll leave. But Thomas and Emma will know because I'll make sure. They understand that love isn't something you feel. It's something you do every single day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Nancy got into her car and drove away, leaving Matt standing alone under the harsh fluorescent lights of the parking garage. Around him, the concrete wall seemed to close in, carrying the weight of everything he'd lost and might never regain. But even as he stood there, drowning in the wreckage of another failed attempt at connection, Matt's phone buzzed with a text. "From the volunteer coordinator. David is asking if you're coming next week. The chemo isn't going well, and he could really use a friend." Matt stared at the message, torn between Nancy's accusation that he was performing and the genuine need of a 10-year-old boy who was fighting for his life. Maybe Nancy was right. Maybe everything he did now was tainted by his past failures, suspect because of his abandonment of her and their children. But David was expecting him. Marcus had asked him to bring a new Batman comic. Sophie was working on a drawing that she wanted to show him. For the first time since this nightmare began, Matt understood the difference between doing something because it would help him and doing something because it was right. Nancy might never forgive him for volunteering at her hospital. The court might never see it as genuine rather than strategic. But David needed him to show up next week. And for once in his life, Matt Hughes was going to be there for someone who needed him, regardless of whether it helped his own cause, even if it cost him everything else. Chapter 6. Fourth Rejection. The Custody Battle. The decision to file for joint custody came during a sleepless November night, 3 months after Nancy's parking garage confrontation. Matt had honored his commitment to David, Marcus, Sophie, and the other children, showing up every week, regardless of Nancy's accusations, but his own children remained strangers. Thomas and Emma were 8 months old now, developing personalities Matt could only glimpse during brief Saturday visits. Emma was cautious and observant, studying his face before gracing him with rare smiles. Thomas was outgoing, reaching for Matt's watch and giggling, but even his openness felt conditional. The breaking point came when Emma took her first steps during a visit. She'd been cruising along furniture when she suddenly let go and took 3 unsteady steps toward Matt before tumbling into his arms. The joy on her face, the pride in her achievement. It was everything Matt had dreamed of as a father, but Nancy would hear about those first steps secondhand from Mrs. Patterson's report. Emma would take first steps again at home, and Nancy would think she was witnessing a milestone when she was seeing a repeat performance. That night, Matt called Richard Morrison. "I want to file for joint custody," Matt said without preamble. "Matt, we've discussed this. Building slowly might be—" "My daughter took her first steps today," Matt interrupted. "And her mother wasn't there because we're trapped in this system where I'm treated like a criminal visiting my own children. Joint custody will be a battle. Ms. Nichols will fight this with everything she has." "Then we fight back," Matt said, his voice harder than he'd ever heard it. "I've done everything the court asked. It's time for my children to know their father as more than a Saturday stranger. Are you sure? Once we file, there's no going back. This will get ugly." Matt thought about Emma's tentative steps, about Thomas's delighted giggle, about all the moments he was missing. "File the papers," he said. Nancy stared at the legal documents scattered across her kitchen table, her hands shaking with a mixture of rage and terror. Petition for modification of custody arrangement. Motion for joint physical custody. Request for overnight visitation. Overnight visitation. The thought of sending Thomas and Emma away for entire nights, of not being there if they cried or needed comfort, made Nancy's chest tight with panic. They were still babies, still nursing, still utterly dependent on the routines and security she'd worked so hard to establish. "He's actually doing this," Sarah said from across the table, her voice tight with disbelief. "After everything you said to him, he's actually trying to take them away from you." "Not take them," Nancy corrected automatically, though the distinction felt meaningless. Joint custody means they'd spend half their time with him, half their lives with a man they barely know. Margaret Yates spread the legal documents with grim efficiency, her expression more serious than Nancy had seen during their previous court. "Attle. This is more aggressive than I expected," Margaret admitted. "Morrison is requesting 50-50 custody, alternating weeks. They're arguing that Mr. Hughes has demonstrated consistency and commitment through his supervised visits and that the children would benefit from equal time with both parents." "They're babies," Nancy said desperately. "They're 8 months old. They need stability, routine, consistency. How is bouncing between 2 houses consistent?" "The courts have been increasingly favorable to fathers' rights," Margaret replied, carefully. And Mr. Hughes has significant advantages: financial stability, a clean record, and he's been consistent with his visits. Plus, the children are responding well to him according to the social worker's reports. Nancy felt the careful control she'd maintained for months beginning to crack. So what are my chances? Margaret hesitated, which was answer enough. If this goes to trial, it's going to be difficult. Morrison will paint a picture of a father who's been systematically denied access to his children despite demonstrating genuine commitment. They'll argue that you're being vindictive, preventing the children from having a relationship with their father. I'm protecting them, Nancy said fiercely. I'm protecting them from a man who abandoned us once and could do it again. I know that, but we need to prove it in court. And that means exposing Mr. Hughes' pattern of abandonment in a way that will convince a judge that joint custody isn't in the children's best interests. Nancy felt trapped between impossible choices: fight and risk losing her children to a man who'd already proven his unreliability. Don't fight and hand them over voluntarily. Either way, Thomas and Emma would pay the price for their parents' failures. What do you need from me? Nancy asked quietly. Everything, Margaret replied. Every detail about your relationship, every promise he broke, every time he chose something else over you and the children. We need to build a case that shows a pattern of abandonment and instability that would make joint custody harmful to the children. The courtroom was packed for the custody hearing. Nancy sat beside Margaret, trying to project calm while her heart hammered. This time, the stakes felt impossibly higher. Not just visitation, but who would raise Thomas and Emma. Morrison rose with theatrical precision. Your Honor, over the past 8 months, Mr. Hughes has demonstrated unwavering commitment to his children. He has attended every scheduled visit, maintained support payments, and taken significant steps to address the personal issues that led to his initial absence. Morrison outlined Matt's therapy sessions, volunteer work, and complete compliance with court orders. Margaret rose for the defense, the uphill battle written in her posture. Your Honor, Mr. Hughes may have been consistent for 8 months, but consistency under court supervision is different from the daily reality of raising children. Ms. Nichols has been sole caregiver since birth, managing midnight feedings, illness, teething, every aspect of their care, while Mr. Hughes enjoyed scheduled, supervised playtime. The character witnesses Morrison called were devastating. Mrs. Patterson testified about Matt's growth as a father. Dr. Walsh spoke about his progress in therapy. Most damaging was Dr. Sarah Kim, a child psychologist. Children benefit enormously from strong relationships with both parents, Dr. Kim explained. Research shows children with involved fathers demonstrate better emotional regulation, higher self-esteem, greater academic success. Denying these children equal time with their father could have lasting negative effects. When Nancy took the stand, she felt like walking to her execution. Ms. Nichols, Margaret began gently, can you describe the daily reality of caring for twin infants? Nancy took a breath, trying to find words that could convey the beautiful exhaustion of motherhood. They wake up every 3 hours, sometimes more often. They need to be fed, changed, comforted. When one sleeps, the other is often awake. I haven't had a full night's sleep in 8 months, but I wouldn't trade a moment of it. Has Mr. Hughes ever cared for the children overnight? No. He's never had them for more than 2 hours at a time, and always with supervision. What concerns do you have about joint custody? Nancy looked across the courtroom at Matt, who was watching her with an expression of such focused attention that it made her chest tight. Thomas and Emma know me. They know my voice, my smell, my touch. I'm their security, their comfort when they're scared or hurt. They don't have that same bond with their father because he hasn't been there for the daily moments that build trust. Morrison's cross-examination was brutal, but expected. He painted Nancy as overprotective, unwilling to allow the children to bond with their father, motivated by spite rather than their best interests. Miss Nichols, isn't it true that you've made no effort to facilitate a deeper relationship between Mr. Hughes and his children? I've followed every court order exactly as written, Nancy replied carefully. That's not what I asked. Have you made any effort to help your children bond with their father outside of the required visits? Nancy felt trapped. The honest answer was no. She'd done nothing to encourage a relationship between Matt and their children beyond what the court mandated. But admitting that made her sound vindictive and uncooperative. I've protected my children from disappointment, she said. Finally, I won't let them get attached to someone who might leave again. But Mr. Hughes hasn't left, has he? He's been consistent for 8 months. 8 months isn't a lifetime, Nancy shot back. 8 months isn't enough to prove that someone who abandoned me during pregnancy is ready to be a reliable father. When Matt took the stand, Nancy braced herself for the same carefully crafted remorse he'd shown during the first hearing. Instead, she got something that surprised her. Raw honesty that cut straight to the heart of their situation. I made the worst mistake of my life when I walked away from Nancy, Matt said, in response to Morrison's opening question. Not just because I hurt her, but because I robbed myself of months with my children that I can never get back. Are you prepared to take on the full responsibilities of joint custody? I'm prepared to try, Matt said, echoing his previous testimony. I've been learning everything I can about child development, about the specific needs of infants. I've baby-proofed my apartment, hired a nanny service for backup support, and rearranged my work schedule to accommodate their needs. Margaret's cross-examination focused on the same themes as before, but this time Matt's answers carried more weight because of his demonstrated consistency. Mr. Hughes, you say you're prepared to take on full responsibility. What happens when one of the children gets sick at 3 a.m, when they're teething and crying inconsolably, when you have a business crisis that demands your attention? The children come first, Matt said without hesitation. I've learned that from watching Nancy these past months. Whatever else is happening in my life, Thomas and Emma's needs come first, and if caring for them becomes overwhelming, if the reality doesn't match your expectations? Matt looked directly at Nancy as he answered, his grey eyes holding hers, with unmistakable sincerity. Then I figure it out, I get help, I learn, I adapt, but I don't run. I've learned the difference between being scared and being a coward, and I won't be a coward when it comes to my children. Judge Chen called a recess, and Nancy followed Margaret into the hallway, her legs unsteady with adrenaline and fear. How bad is it? Nancy asked, though she already knew the answer from Margaret's expression. Bad, Margaret admitted. He's been consistent, he's prepared, and the children respond well to him. Unless we can prove actual unfitness or danger, the court is likely to grant some form of expanded custody. When court reconvened, Judge Chen delivered her ruling with the clinical precision Nancy had come to dread. This court has considered all testimony and evidence presented. While Ms. Nichols has been an exemplary primary caregiver, the evidence shows that Mr. Hughes has demonstrated genuine commitment to his children and has taken significant steps to address the issues that led to his initial absence. Nancy felt the world tilting sideways as Judge Chen continued. However, given the children's young age and their established routine with Ms. Nichols, this court will implement a graduated custody schedule. Mr. Hughes will have overnight visitation every other weekend, expanding to alternating weeks when the children turn 18 months old. Ms. Nichols will retain primary physical custody, but both parents will share legal custody and decision-making responsibilities. Nancy barely heard the rest of the ruling through the roaring in her ears. Overnight visits, legal custody, decision-making responsibilities. She'd lost, not completely, but catastrophically enough that her world would never be the same. Outside, The courthouse. Nancy stood on the steps while Margaret gathered her papers and prepared to leave. Matt emerged from the building with his legal team, but when he saw Nancy, he dismissed them with a gesture and walked toward her. "Nancy," he said quietly, and she could hear something that might have been regret in his voice. She turned to face him, surprised by the numbness that had replaced her earlier panic. "Congratulations, you got what you wanted." "This isn't what I wanted," Matt replied, echoing his words from 8 months earlier. "I wanted us to work together for the children's sake. I wanted to find a way to be a family, even if not the traditional kind." Nancy laughed, but it came out broken and sharp. "You wanted a fight, you got one, and you lost. I still have primary custody, and the children will still call me when they're scared in the middle of the night. You get weekends and every other holiday, but you don't get to be their real parent." The words were cruel, and Nancy knew it. But she was drowning in the reality of what had just happened, and cruelty felt like the only life preserver available. "They're my children too," Matt said quietly. "I know I haven't earned the right to be their father yet, but I'm going to keep trying until I do." Nancy stared at him. This man who'd destroyed her trust and was now systematically dismantling the life she'd built for their children. For a moment, she saw a flicker of the man she'd once loved, vulnerable, determined, carrying his own pain, but refusing to let it defeat him. Then the moment passed, and all she could see was the enemy who'd just won a battle she couldn't afford to lose. "You wanted to fight for our children," Nancy said, her voice cold with finality. "Good, but understand this. Every day they spend with you, they'll know that you're the man who abandoned their mother when she needed you most. They'll know that you had to be forced by a court to be their father, and when they're old enough to choose, they'll choose the parent who was there from the beginning." She walked away without looking back, leaving Matt standing alone on the courthouse steps. But even as she climbed into Sarah's car, even as she told herself she'd fight this new arrangement every step of the way, Nancy couldn't shake the memory of the pain in Matt's eyes when she delivered her final blow. For the first time since this legal nightmare began, she wondered if maybe her need to protect her children was causing as much damage as the man she was trying to protect them from. Chapter 7. The Breaking Point. 8 months after the twins' birth, Matt's life had settled into a rhythm that felt simultaneously routine and heartbreaking. Every other Friday, he transformed his sterile penthouse into something resembling a home for 2 18-month-old children who remained beautiful, polite strangers. Thomas and Emma had learned his patterns. They knew he would read them stories in silly voices, that he had specific toys just for them, that he was the weekend father who tried too hard and smiled too much. But they didn't run to him when they fell down. They didn't seek his comfort when they were scared. When they cried, they asked for Mama with the heartbreaking certainty of children who knew exactly who their safe person was. And it wasn't the man who bought them expensive toys and lived in an apartment that felt more like a museum than a home. The overnight visits were exercises in careful choreography. Matt had hired Maria Santos, a nanny with 20 years of experience, to help during the children's stays. Not because he couldn't handle 2 toddlers alone, but because Thomas and Emma needed the security of someone who felt familiar when their world shifted every other weekend. "They're good children," Maria often told him, watching as Matt tried to coax Emma to eat her dinner or convince Thomas to play with something other than the cardboard box his expensive toys had come in. "But they don't know you yet. They're polite with you like you're a nice stranger. It takes time to feel like family." Time. The one thing Matt couldn't buy, couldn't negotiate, couldn't force. Every other weekend, he got 48 hours to prove himself worthy of children who'd already decided that love lived in a small apartment across town with a mother who sang off-key lullabies and knew exactly how to make their fears disappear. His therapist sessions with Dr. Walsh had become exercises in brutal honesty about the impossible situation he'd created for himself. "Tell me about this weekend," Dr. Walsh said during their Tuesday session. Her patient attention focused on the man who'd learned to dissect his own failures with clinical precision. "Emma had a nightmare," Matt said, staring at his hands. "She woke up crying for Nancy, and nothing I did could comfort her. I tried reading to her, singing songs I'd heard Nancy sing, even calling Nancy to see if she could help over the phone. But Emma just kept crying for her mama, and I felt like an intruder in my own child's life. How did that make you feel?" Matt was quiet for a long moment, searching for words that could capture the devastating loneliness of being needed by children who didn't actually want you, like I was being punished for the rest of my life for one terrible decision, he said finally. "Like no matter what I do, how consistent I am, how much I love them, I'll always be the substitute parent. The one they tolerate because they have to, not the one they choose because they want to. Do you think that's Nancy's fault?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Matt's first instinct was to say yes. Nancy could have made this easier, could have helped the children adjust, could have been less cold during their exchanges. But his months of therapy had taught him to look deeper than his initial reactions. "It's my fault," he admitted. "I created this situation when I walked away from Nancy during her pregnancy. Everything else, the legal battles, the children's confusion, their preference for their mother, is just the consequence of that original choice. What would it take to change the dynamic?" Matt laughed, but there was no humor in it. "A time machine, the ability to go back and be the man Nancy needed me to be from the beginning. Since time travel isn't available, what's the alternative?" "I don't know," Matt said honestly. "I keep showing up, keep trying, keep hoping that eventually Thomas and Emma will see me as more than the weekend obligation. But sometimes I think they'd be better off if I just disappeared again." Dr. Walsh leaned forward, slightly, her expression sharpening. "Do you really believe that?" "No," Matt said immediately, "but I think about it. When Emma cries for her mama and I can't comfort her. When Thomas asks when he gets to go home during our Saturday at the park. When they both light up when Nancy comes to pick them up in a way they never light up when they see me. I think about whether my presence in their lives is helping them or just making everyone miserable." It was this conversation that was replaying in Matt's head when his assistant burst into his office on a Thursday afternoon in December, her usually composed demeanor shattered by whatever news she was carrying. "Mr. Hughes," Jennifer said breathlessly, "there's been a fire at Nancy's apartment building. The children—" Matt was moving before she finished the sentence, grabbing his keys and jacket while his heart hammered against his ribs. The drive to Nancy's neighborhood passed in a blur of traffic lights and worst-case scenarios. By the time he arrived at the scene, the fire department had the blaze under control, but the building's facade was blackened with smoke damage, and the parking lot was full of displaced residents clutching whatever belongings they'd managed to save. Matt found Nancy sitting on the curb across the street, still in her hospital scrubs, holding Thomas and Emma, while she stared at the building that had been their home. Red Cross volunteers distributed blankets and water, but Nancy seemed oblivious to everything except the two children in her arms. Matt approached slowly, afraid that his presence would somehow make this tragedy worse. When Nancy looked up and saw him, her face went through a rapid progression of emotions: surprise, wariness, and then something that looked dangerously close to relief. "How did you—" she started to ask. Jennifer saw it on the news, Matty explained quietly, kneeling on the pavement beside them. "Are you hurt? Are the children okay?" "We're fine," Nancy said automatically, but her voice shook as she said it. "We got out in time. Everyone got out. But everything else—" She gestured helplessly toward the building, and Matt could see smoke-damaged windows on what he knew was the third floor, where Nancy's small apartment had been their sanctuary. Thomas looked up at Matt with curious eyes, apparently unfazed by the chaos around them. "Dada," he said clearly, using the word Nancy had taught both children despite everything between them. "Fire truck." "I see it, buddy," Matt said softly, his heart breaking at the casual way his son included him in this moment of crisis. "Big red truck, right?" Emma was less interested in conversation, her face pressed against Nancy's shoulder with the exhausted surrender of a child who'd been through too much excitement for one day. But when she caught sight of Matt, she reached out one small hand toward him, a gesture of trust that felt like an unexpected gift. "Nancy," Matt said carefully, "I know you don't want my help, but—" "Don't," Nancy interrupted, but her voice lacked its usual sharp edge. "Just don't. I can't handle your pity on top of everything else." Matt settled more comfortably on the curb, ignoring the December cold seeping through his expensive suit. "It's not pity." "Then what is it?" The question hung between them, and Matt realized this was the first real conversation they'd had in months that wasn't filtered through lawyers or social workers or the careful choreography of custody exchanges. "It's love," he said simply. "I love you. I've loved you this whole time, and I was too broken to admit it." Nancy's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Love? You think this is love? Showing up at my worst moment with your declarations?" "No," Matt said quietly. "Love would have been staying when things got hard the first time. Love would have been answering your calls when you were pregnant and scared. Love would have been fighting for us instead of running away." Nancy stared at him, clearly not expecting such unvarnished honesty. Around them, the controlled chaos of the fire scene continued, firefighters checking for hotspots, Red Cross volunteers coordinating temporary housing, neighbors comforting each other over the shock of sudden displacement. "So what is this then?" Nancy asked, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise. "This is me understanding too late what I threw away," Matt replied. "This is me knowing that I can't fix what I broke, but refusing to compound the damage by disappearing again." Emma had fallen asleep against Nancy's shoulder, her small face peaceful despite the chaos around them. Thomas was fighting sleep with the determination of a toddler who didn't want to miss anything interesting, his eyes heavy but fixed on the fire trucks with fascination. "My sister is coming to get us," Nancy said eventually. "We'll stay with her until we can find another place." Matt nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The urge to offer his penthouse, his resources, his help was overwhelming. But he'd learned that Nancy's independence was both her strength and her armor. She wouldn't accept his help because accepting it would mean acknowledging that she needed him, and she'd worked too hard to build a life that didn't depend on unreliable men. "The children's things," Matt said instead. "Their clothes, their toys, gone," Nancy said flatly. "Everything's gone. Their baby books, their first outfits, the blankets they've slept with since birth, all of it." The devastation in her voice broke something in Matt's chest. Those weren't just possessions. They were the tangible proof of Thomas and Emma's brief history, the artifacts of their mother's love that couldn't be replaced with money or good intentions. "I'm so sorry," Matt said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in months. "Are you?" Nancy turned to look at him directly, her brown eyes holding more pain than anger for the first time since the hospital. "Are you sorry this happened, or are you sorry you can't fix it?" The question was fair and devastating. Matt had spent so many months trying to fix what he'd broken through legal action and grand gestures that he'd forgotten how to simply sit with someone else's pain without trying to solve it. "I'm sorry you and the children are going through this," he said carefully. "I'm sorry that life keeps throwing obstacles at you when you're already carrying so much. And I'm sorry that my presence here probably makes it harder instead of easier." Nancy was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to decide whether his words were genuine or another performance. "You want to know the worst part?" she said finally. "The worst part is that when I saw you walking toward us, for just a second I was relieved. For one stupid moment I thought, thank God someone's here who can help. And then I remembered that you're not someone I can count on. The words hit him like physical blows, each one precisely aimed at the heart of his failures. But underneath, the pain. Matt heard something that gave him the tiniest spark of hope. Nancy had been relieved to see him, even if only for a moment. "You can count on me," he said quietly. "I know my track record doesn't support that, but Nancy, you can count on me. For the children, for whatever you need, for as long as you need it." "Can I?" Nancy's voice was raw with exhaustion and unshed tears. "Can I count on you when the legal bills pile up? When the insurance company tries to deny our claim? When the children ask why we can't go home? Will you still be here when helping us stops feeling noble and starts feeling like work?" Matt looked at his children. Thomas finally succumbing to sleep in Nancy's arms, Emma drooling slightly on her mother's shoulder, and felt something settle in his chest that he'd never experienced before. Not the desperate love that demanded reciprocation, not the guilty need to fix what he'd broken, but simple, unwavering commitment. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I'll be here for whatever comes next, whether you want me here or not. Not because I expect anything from you, not because I think it will earn me forgiveness, but because you're the mother of my children, and you shouldn't have to face this alone." Nancy stared at him for a long moment, and Matt saw her carefully constructed walls wavering slightly. "My sister is coming," she repeated, but with less conviction than before. "Okay," Matt said simply. "I'll wait with you until she gets here." And so they sat together on the curb as the December darkness fell around them, two people who'd loved each other and lost each other, holding the children who connected them permanently despite all the damage between them. For the first time in over a year, they weren't adversaries or co-parents managing a difficult arrangement. They were just two people who'd been through something terrible and were trying to figure out what came next. When Sarah arrived an hour later, she found them still sitting together, Thomas and Emma sleeping peacefully despite the chaos, their parents watching over them with the vigilant attention of people who understood that everything could change in an instant. "Nancy?" Sarah called, softly, and Nancy looked up with the dazed expression of someone emerging from shock. "Sarah," Nancy said, relief evident in her voice. "Thank you for coming." Matt stood as Sarah approached, prepared for the hostility that usually accompanied any interaction with Nancy's family. Instead, Sarah looked at him with something that might have been grudging respect. "You came," Sarah said simply. "Of course." "I came," Matt replied, carefully transferring a sleeping Thomas to Sarah's arms. "They're my children too." As Nancy gathered Emma and their few salvaged belongings, Matt hung back, uncertain whether his continued presence would be welcome or invasive. Nancy paused beside him as Sarah headed toward her car. "Thank you," Nancy said quietly, not quite meeting his eyes. "For staying, for not trying to fix everything, for just being here." "Always," Matt said, the word carrying the weight of a promise he finally understood how to keep. "Whatever you need, whenever you need it, I'll be here." Nancy nodded once, then walked away toward her sister's car and whatever temporary refuge they could provide. But for the first time since that awful night when he destroyed their relationship, Matt felt like maybe, just maybe, he'd taken a step toward becoming the man Nancy had needed him to be all along. Even if it was too late to save what they'd lost, maybe it wasn't too late to build something new from the ashes. Chapter 8. The Long Road Back. Matt didn't contact Nancy for 2 months after the fire, not because he didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at him to check on them, to offer help, to insert himself into their crisis. But Dr. Walsh had taught him the difference between supporting someone and overwhelming them. And Nancy had spent over a year building walls his good intentions had only reinforced. Instead, Matt channeled his energy into becoming the man he should have been from the beginning. Therapy sessions increased to 3 times a week, diving deeper into the abandonment patterns that had shaped 32 years of emotional avoidance. Dr. Walsh pushed him past comfortable insights into the messy work of actually changing behavioral patterns that had been decades in the making. "Tell me about the Al-Anon meeting," Dr. Walsh said during a particularly difficult session in January. Matt shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It felt strange at first. I'm not an addict, and neither are my parents." But the abandonment patterns, they're similar. The way people leave when things get difficult, the way families break apart under pressure. Listening to people talk about making amends, about the difference between saying sorry and actually changing, it felt relevant. The Al-Anon meetings had become Matt's most honest hour each week. Sitting in a circle of people who understood, loving someone unreliable, he learned about the damage inconsistency caused and the long road back to trustworthiness. "Step 9 is about making amends," shared Patricia, a woman whose husband had been sober for 5 years. "But real amends aren't about what we say, they're about how we live differently going forward." Matt had started making anonymous amends before he understood what he was doing. The Displaced Families Fund had grown quietly, helping not just Nancy's neighbors, but families across Seattle who'd lost homes to fires, floods, and economic disasters. He wasn't trying to buy forgiveness. He was learning what it meant to be useful to people who needed help without expecting anything in return. The volunteer work at the hospital continued, despite Nancy's accusations about his motives. David was in full remission now, a 13-year-old cancer survivor who still wanted to debate superhero movies. Marcus had started high school, his childhood battle with leukemia just a memory that made him more compassionate than most teenagers. Sophie was 8 now, and her artwork had evolved from stick figures to detailed portraits of the nurses who'd saved her life. "You keep coming back," Sophie observed during one of their art sessions. "Even when people are mean to you." Matt paused. In his coloring, Sophie had insisted he help with a particularly complex rainbow. "What do you mean?" "Some of the grown-ups think you're only here to make yourself feel better, but you keep reading to us, even when they whisper about you." The observation hit harder than any of Nancy's accusations. These children, fighting battles that would destroy most adults, had noticed his consistency when the people who mattered most to him saw only manipulation. "I keep coming back because you guys are worth it," Matt said simply. "Whatever anyone else thinks doesn't change that." When he finally contacted Nancy, it was through a letter delivered by Sarah, not because he was avoiding Nancy, but because he wanted his words to reach her without the pressure of immediate response. "Nancy, I'm not writing this to ask for anything or to try to convince you of anything. I'm writing because I need you to know that I understand now why you couldn't trust me to be a father to Thomas and Emma. I spent our entire relationship terrified that you would leave me, so I left first. I told myself I was protecting both of us from inevitable pain, but I was really just protecting myself from the vulnerability that comes with loving someone completely. When you told me about the pregnancy, my first thought wasn't about the children we'd created. It was about how much it would hurt when you realized I wasn't worth staying for. I was wrong about everything. You weren't going to leave me. You were trying to build a life with me. And our children, they weren't a trap or a burden. They were a gift I was too broken to receive. I've been attending Al-Anon meetings, learning about the damage that emotional abandonment causes and the work it takes to become reliable. I understand now that change isn't about grand gestures or perfect words. It's about showing up consistently, especially when it's difficult. I can't promise I'll never be scared again, but I can promise I'll never run again. Not from you, not from our children, not from the work it takes to be worthy of the love you offered me. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for another chance. I'm simply telling you that I'm doing the work to become a better man, not because I expect it to change anything between us, but because Thomas and Emma deserve a father who has learned the difference between loving someone and being afraid of losing them. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that loving you was the best thing I ever did, even though I was too much of a coward to do it right the first time. Matt. Sarah had called him 3 days later. She read it, was all she said, but Matt heard something in her voice that might have been approval. How is she? How are the children? Tired. They're staying with me, which is crowded but manageable. Nancy's looking for a new apartment, but everything in her price range is either too small or too far from the hospital. Matt had bitten back the offer to help with housing costs. Nancy's independence wasn't just pride, it was survival. She'd learned not to depend on unreliable people, and his money couldn't buy his way back into the category of people she could count on. "Tell her," Matt started, then stopped. "Tell her I hope they find something good, and that if she ever needs anything, not money, just anything, she can call." "I'll tell her," Sarah said, and hung up. The business crisis hit in February, threatening to destroy everything Matt had built over the past decade. A key investor was pulling out, taking half their funding and leaving the company vulnerable to a hostile takeover. The old Matt would have thrown himself into 18-hour days, would have used the crisis as an excuse to avoid everything else in his life. Instead, Matt maintained his schedule. Therapy sessions, hospital visits, Al-Anon meetings, none of. It changed despite the professional emergency. When his board demanded he cancel everything else to focus on saving the company, Matt had surprised himself with his response. "The company matters," he told them during an emergency meeting. "But it's not the only thing that matters. I have commitments to people who are depending on me, and I won't break those commitments even if it costs us everything." Somehow, that clarity of priority had made him a better businessman rather than a worse one. Knowing that some things were more important than profit had helped him negotiate from a position of genuine strength rather than desperate fear. The company survived. More importantly, Matt had proven to himself that he could face a crisis without abandoning the people who mattered most to him. Chapter 9. Earning Trust. Nancy's call came on a rainy Thursday in March, 10 months after the twins' birth. Matt was reviewing quarterly projections when his phone rang with a number he'd memorized but hadn't seen in months. "It's Nancy," she said without preamble. "Can we talk?" Matt's heart rate spiked, but his voice remained steady. "Of course. What do you need?" "I got your letter. I've been thinking about what you said, about showing up consistently. I want to try something different with the visits." They met at the hospital's family room, neutral territory where Nancy felt comfortable and Matt felt appropriately humbled. Nancy looked tired but determined, her hair pulled back in the practical style he remembered from their early days together. "The supervised visits aren't working," Nancy said without preamble. "Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because the children can't really get to know you in 2-hour blocks with a stranger watching." Matt nodded, afraid to hope but unable to suppress it completely. "What are you proposing?" "Unsupervised visits, here at the hospital, in the playroom. 2 hours, twice a week to start. If it goes well—" Nancy paused, clearly struggling with the words. "If it goes well, we can talk about expanding it." "What changed your mind?" Nancy was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the Seattle skyline. "Your letter, the way you handled your business crisis without disappearing. Sarah told me you could have lost everything, but you didn't change your schedule, didn't cancel your commitments to anyone else." "Those commitments matter to me," Matt said simply. "I know. That's what changed my mind. The new visits were a revelation. Without Mrs. Patterson taking notes in the corner, without the artificial constraints of supervised visits, Matt finally got to see his children as they really were rather than as they performed for strangers. Emma was cautious but curious, studying Matt's face with serious brown eyes before accepting his offerings of books or toys. When she finally smiled at him, genuinely smiled, not the polite response of supervised visits, Matt felt something crack open in his chest that had been locked away for months. Thomas was pure energy, climbing on everything, chattering in his developing vocabulary, treating Matt's watch like the world's most fascinating object. When he fell and immediately looked to Matt for comfort rather than crying for Mama, Matt understood what it meant to be needed by his children. "Dada," Thomas said one afternoon, handing Matt a toy car with the casual confidence of a child who'd finally decided this particular adult was trustworthy. "Drive car?" "We can drive the car," Matt agreed, settling onto the floor beside his son. "Where should we go?" "Hospital," Thomas declared with toddler logic. "See Mama." The casual way Thomas included Matt in his world, the assumption that they would do things together, made Matt's throat tight with emotion he couldn't express. This was what he'd been fighting for, not legal rights or custody schedules, but the simple trust of children who were learning to love him. Nancy watched these interactions from across the playroom, and Matt could see something shifting in her expression. She was seeing him not as the man who'd abandoned her, but as the father he was becoming. The business crisis that had threatened his company in February was nothing compared to the personal crisis that hit in late April. A competitor launched a hostile takeover attempt, backed by investors who saw Matt's company as undervalued and vulnerable. The financial press was calling it the business story of the year, and Matt's lawyers were demanding 18-hour days to mount a defense. "You need to cancel everything else," his lead attorney insisted during an emergency meeting. "This is about survival. Everything else is secondary." Matt looked around the conference table at men in expensive suits who'd never had to choose between professional success and personal integrity. "No," he said quietly. "I have commitments that matter. More than this company, more than losing everything you've built?" "Yes," Matt said without hesitation. "Much more." He kept his visit schedule with Thomas and Emma, showing up tired but present, proving to himself and to Nancy that his priorities had fundamentally shifted. When Emma was sick with a stomach bug and couldn't keep anything down, Matt spent their entire visit holding her while she dozed fitfully against his chest, grateful to be useful in such a simple, fundamental way. "You didn't have to come today," Nancy observed, sitting beside him as Emma slept. "She's just going to sleep the whole time." "She needs to know I'll be here even when she's not at her best," Matt replied, adjusting Emma's position so she could sleep more comfortably. "Especially when she's not at her best." Nancy stared at him for a long moment, and Matt saw something that looked dangerously like the beginning of forgiveness flicker across her features. The takeover attempt failed, largely because Matt's focused leadership during the crisis had impressed investors and employees alike. But Matt barely noticed the professional victory because something much more important was happening in his personal life. Thomas and Emma were beginning to love him. Not just tolerate his presence or enjoy his visits, but actually love him with the uncomplicated affection of children who decided he was safe and reliable and worth their trust. It was during a particularly good visit in May, Thomas building block towers for Matt to knock down, while Emma crawled determinedly toward a toy just out of reach, that Nancy delivered the news that threatened to destroy everything Matt had worked to build. "I need to tell you something," Nancy said, her voice carefully neutral in the way that preceded devastating news. Matt looked up from the block tower Thomas had demolished with delighted giggles, his heart rate spiking with familiar panic. "I've been offered a job," Nancy continued, "head pediatric nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital. It's everything I've wanted professionally." Matt felt the blood drain from his face. "That's incredible, Nancy. You deserve that." The position is in Boston. The words hit him like a physical blow. Boston, 3,000 miles away. Thomas and Emma would become holiday visitors if he was lucky. It's a full relocation package, Nancy continued, watching his face carefully. Amazing benefits, a chance for the twins to grow up somewhere beautiful, near the ocean, good schools, a fresh start for all of us. Matt felt the old panic rising, the urge to fight, to offer money, to use his resources to keep them in Seattle. But months of therapy had taught him to sit with discomfort rather than reacting from fear. "When do you need to decide?" he asked quietly. 2 weeks, Nancy replied. "I wanted to tell you first, before I made any decisions." Matt nodded, his heart breaking but his voice steady. "Thank you for telling me." They finished the visit in subdued, quiet, Thomas and Emma, oblivious to the adult crisis unfolding around them. As Nancy gathered their things to leave, Matt made the hardest decision of his life. "Nancy," he said softly, "whatever you decide, I want you to know that I'll support it. If Boston is what's best for you and the children, then that's what matters." Nancy stared at him in surprise, clearly expecting a fight. "You're not going to try to stop me?" "No," Matt said, meaning it completely. "I love you, and I love them enough to want what's best for you, even if it destroys me." For the first time in over a year, Nancy looked at Matt Hughes and saw the man she'd fallen in love with, someone willing to put her needs above his own fears, even when it cost him everything he'd fought to build. Chapter 10. Fighting for Forever. Nancy told Matt about her decision during what might be their last visit. They sat in the hospital playroom while Thomas and Emma napped in their strollers, exhausted from an afternoon of energetic play. The silence carried the weight of choices that would determine their family's future. "I've been thinking about Boston," Nancy said quietly, watching their sleeping children rather than Matt's face. "It really is everything I've always wanted. Head pediatric nurse at one of the country's best children's hospitals. The salary alone would mean never worrying about money again." Matt felt his heart breaking with each word, but he kept his expression neutral. "It sounds like an incredible opportunity." "It is," Nancy agreed. "The twins would grow up near the ocean. Great schools, cultural opportunities, a chance to start fresh, somewhere no one knows our history." "Have you decided?" Nancy finally looked at him, and Matt saw something vulnerable in her expression that he hadn't seen since the night he destroyed their relationship. "I keep asking myself what's best for Thomas and Emma," she said slowly. "And I keep coming back to the same question. What kind of life do I want to model for them?" Matt waited, afraid to speak and influence a decision that belonged entirely to Nancy. "Do I want to teach them that when life gets difficult, you run away to somewhere easier? That when people hurt you, you put 3,000 miles between yourself and the possibility of being hurt again? Sometimes running away is self-preservation," Matt said gently. "Sometimes it's the healthy choice. And sometimes it's just fear dressed up as wisdom," Nancy replied. "I've been afraid for so long, Matt. Afraid to trust you. Afraid to believe. You've really changed. Afraid to let the children get attached to someone who might leave again. But watching you these past months..." She trailed off, and Matt felt hope and terror warring in his chest. "What have you decided?" he asked quietly. Nancy took a deep breath, the kind that preceded life-changing announcements. "I'm turning down Boston." Matt felt the air leave his lungs in a rush. "Nancy, you don't have to. I'm not doing it for you," she interrupted firmly. "I'm doing it because running away, even to something good, would be making the same mistake you made. I'm staying because this is where we're building our life, and I won't let fear make my decisions anymore." The words hung between them like a bridge neither of them had expected to cross. Matt looked at Nancy, this incredible woman who'd raised their children alone and somehow found the courage to forgive him despite everything he'd done to earn her mistrust. "What does that mean for us?" Matt asked carefully. I don't know, Nancy admitted, but I think I'd like to find out if you're willing to try again, slowly, with rules and boundaries and the understanding that trust has to be rebuilt one day at a time. Matt felt tears gathering in his eyes, emotions too, big for the careful control he'd maintained for months. Nancy, I would do anything for the chance to try again. Not anything, Nancy corrected with a small smile. Just the right things. Every day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Their first real date happened 3 weeks later. Dinner. At the same diner where they'd shared pie during their first relationship. Nancy looked beautiful in a simple blue dress that made her skin glow, but Matt could see the nervousness in her posture, the careful way she sat across from him like someone prepared to flee at the first sign of disappointment. This is strange, Nancy admitted, poking at her salad with uncertain focus. Dating the father of my children, trying to fall in love with someone I already know, can break my heart. We don't have to do this, Matt said immediately. If it's too weird, if it brings up too much— No, Nancy interrupted. I want to try. I need you to understand that this isn't about getting back what we had. That relationship ended when you walked away. This is about building something new. Matt nodded, understanding the distinction. What do you need from me? Time, Nancy said simply. Patience. The understanding that some days I'll look at you and see the man I'm falling in love with, and other days I'll see the man who abandoned me when I was pregnant and scared. I need you to be okay with both. I can do that, Matt promised. The relationship that emerged was different from their first attempt, more careful, more intentional, built on a foundation of earned trust rather than passionate impulse. Matt courted Nancy with the patience of someone who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. Small gestures rather than grand ones. Consistency rather than intensity. They attended family therapy together, learning to communicate without the defensive patterns they developed during their legal battles. Thomas and Emma adjusted to seeing their parents together with the adaptability of children who'd never known their family to be simple or conventional. Mama, Dada, together, Thomas observed one afternoon when they'd all gone to the park, his toddler vocabulary capturing something profound in its simplicity. Yes, baby, Nancy replied, watching Matt push Emma on the swing with gentle patience. Together. The proposal came 6 months later, not with fireworks or photographers, but during a quiet moment after they'd put the twins to bed in Nancy's new apartment. Matt had been staying over more frequently, helping with bedtime routines and morning chaos, learning the rhythm of family life he'd missed. Nancy was grading paperwork from a difficult day when Matt knelt beside her chair, a simple ring box in his hands. Nancy, he said quietly, waiting until she looked up. I can't promise I'll never be scared again. I can't promise perfection or that I won't make mistakes. But I can promise I'll never run again. Will you marry a man who's finally learned the difference between being afraid and being a coward? Nancy stared at the ring, simple, elegant, nothing like the ostentatious display the old Matt might have chosen, and then at the man offering it. This wasn't the charming businessman who'd swept her off her feet 2 years ago. This was someone, harder won, more genuine, proven by time and tested by difficulty. Yes, she said simply, and meant it with every fibre of her being. They married 6 months later in the hospital chapel where they'd first met, surrounded by colleagues who'd witnessed their journey and children from the pediatric ward who'd taught them both about courage. Thomas and Emma served as ring-bearers, toddling down the aisle with the serious concentration of children given important jobs. David, now 15 and cancer-free, read a passage about second chances. Sophie, 10 and thriving, presented Nancy with a drawing of their family, stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, reading, "People who choose each other." As Matt and Nancy exchanged vows, promising to choose each other daily, especially when difficult, Neither pretended their love story had been easy or conventional, but looking at their children, their friends, the community they'd built from the ashes of their first attempt, they knew they'd found something more valuable than easy. They'd found a love worth fighting for, worth earning, worth keeping.